The past few releases of AutoCAD, a very powerful parametric design functionality has grown and become even more robust in AutoCAD 2012. And as with most things that have a lot of functionality and features, it can seem somewhat complex when you first dig into it. Therefore, it's worthwhile to have an overview kind of orientation as to what's exactly going on with these parametric functionalities to see how they work so that you can break things down in more detail and start understanding what's happening a little more effectively. So for an orientation, what we have here is just a basic wall diagram of some interior space with a couple of associated dimensions and things that you don't see, which would be called geometric constraints. So what we'll go ahead and do first is show you all the geometric constraints that are actually present in this, and then of course you tend to see the dimensional constraints out here. These are somewhat familiar to you, just like dimensional entities would be. We can go ahead and switch these off this way. And I'm using the ribbon here in the parametric ribbon tab to access these types of commands. Essentially what is happening is all the things that you would normally think of as being object snap related, like lines being perpendicular to one another or parallel to one another, or concentric or tangent, or located on a common center point. Those types of things, or having an extension line, a common plane of reference like we would see down here in this horizontal, all these things are essentially now what we would call constraints. And you can see something analogous, not exactly like object snaps, but something that is analogous to object snaps up here in the geometric constraints. What these constraints are going to do is tell the geometry how to move with relation to each other. So as we start looking at why do these points remain together, or why do these lines move in tandem to act like a wall rather than two separate lines, the constraints are actually what's doing that. So we can take an example here. We would just pick a point on the outside wall here, which is a line, as you can see, and then we see some of the constraints that are actually in action here in the form of glyphs. I'll just select this central gripping point, which would tend to give me a move type of operation. So as I would move this entity over here, you can actually see the other geometry is intelligently coming along. What we would normally think of as a def point for the basis of this dimension comes along with it as well. So it would be very easy to start just grabbing and stretching and doing more of a kind of a holistic approach to manipulating the geometry. Now, the other functionality that we pick up that's worth noting is for dimensional type constraints, and we see an example here. This allows you to simply double click on the dimension and override an existing value with a value of your choice, and that dimension will then drive the geometry to conform with that dimensional entity that you're putting in there. And that will force the geometry to go ahead and move with it. Now, the dimensions drive why this is 95 feet. The constraints over here explain why the building moves along and stays associated with itself like you just saw. So the core idea is to understand what the geometric constraints and the dimensional constraints can do for you, and then just learn about some of the other functionalities that we'll see, like auto-constraining and working with the parameters manager and deletion of constraints, just so that it becomes familiar and easy for you to manage. That's your overview. Now we can start digging in.